There's a particular kind of silence that settles over a marriage when trust begins to rot from the inside. You don't hear it all at once. It comes in increments, a hesitation where there used to be ease, an answer that arrives just a half-second too late, eyes that find the floor when they used to find yours. By the early 2000s, I had learned to hear that silence. I just hadn't yet admitted to myself what it meant. Our kids were 4 and 6. Young enough to still believe in magic, old enough to accidentally tell you the truth. That's the thing nobody warns you about when you become a parent. Children are the world's most guileless informants. They don't lie. They don't know yet that some pieces of information are supposed to stay compartmentalized. They just talk. And in their talking, they slowly, innocently, began to dismantle everything I thought I knew about my life. It started small. Innocuous. The kind of thing you could easily explain away if you were inclined towards self-deception, which, I'll admit, I briefly was. The kids started mentioning their grandparents more, my wife's parents, who lived about 90 minutes outside the city. At first I didn't think much of it. Grandparents are grandparents. Kids love them. But then the frequency started to register. 2 times a week. Sometimes 3. On every day she wasn't clocking in at her part-time job. Something in the back of my mind raised its hand and asked, quietly, when exactly did this start? I brought it up with her one evening, keeping my voice casual, just making conversation. She denied it, not with outrage or confusion, the way an innocent person might, but with a kind of practiced deflection that landed wrong. My wife had many fine qualities. Being a convincing liar was never one of them. I watched her face as she answered me, and I noticed what I always noticed when she was being less than truthful, the slight quickening of speech, the way her eyes moved just slightly to the left, the smile that arrived a fraction of a moment too late to be genuine. I didn't push. I filed it away. Instead, I started tracking the mileage on her car. I know how that sounds. Clinical. Cold. Paranoid, even. But I want to be clear about something. I wasn't tracking her because I wanted to build a case. I was tracking her because I needed to know if I was losing my mind. I needed the numbers to either confirm or dispel what my gut had been whispering to me for weeks. And the numbers did not lie. Week after week, the odometer told a story that her words refused to tell. An extra 400 miles. Every single week. 400 miles that had no explanation, no destination, no innocent interpretation I could construct no matter how hard I tried. I knew. Not the details. Not the name. Not the face. But I knew. That specific weight, the weight of knowing something terrible is true while still lacking the proof to say it out loud, is one of the heaviest things a person can carry. I carried it quietly for a while, trying to decide what to do next. And then the universe, in its strange and ironic way, handed me the door. I sat down at the computer one ordinary afternoon and there, stuck to the monitor like a small paper bomb, was a post-it note in my wife's handwriting. Her AOL password. Just sitting there. An accident, almost certainly. A moment of carelessness that would detonate consequences neither of us could have fully anticipated. I stared at that note for a long time. I thought about what it meant to look. About privacy, about trust, about the fact that trust had already been broken, I just couldn't prove it yet. I thought about my parents. I thought about what their years of mutual deception had done to us kids, how it had cracked something fundamental in the way I understood love and safety, how it had left splinters in me I was still occasionally finding in adulthood. I thought about my own children, 4 and 6, who had no idea that the ground beneath their feet might be about to shift. I typed in the password. The emails loaded in that slow, dial-up way that felt, in the moment, almost ceremonial, as if even the internet understood the gravity of what was being revealed. And there they were. A thread of messages between my wife and her college best friend, warm and gossipy in tone, the kind of frank, unguarded communication women have with their closest confidants. Except embedded in the warmth and the gossip were the details I had been both dreading and needing to find. She was sleeping with someone. An ex-boyfriend from high school. Regularly. Not a single moment of recklessness but an ongoing, deliberate, sustained affair. And in the emails, with the casual cruelty that sometimes surfaces in private correspondence, she made fun of his wife. Specifically, she mocked her for gaining weight after having kids. That detail, the mockery, hit me in a way I hadn't expected. The betrayal itself I had been steeling myself for. But that contempt, directed at a woman who presumably had no idea her marriage was being dismantled, added something else to the equation. It told me something about the character of what was happening. This wasn't a desperate, guilt-ridden entanglement. It was comfortable. Easy. Almost cheerful. I printed the emails. Every page. I folded them carefully and put them somewhere safe. Then I closed the browser, cleared the history, and went about the rest of my day. I had work to do. I called a friend of mine who worked in law enforcement. Not to ask him to do anything improper, just to think out loud with someone I trusted, someone who understood how information worked and how to get more of it. He listened carefully, and then he gave me a name. A guy who'd left the force a few years prior to start his own private investigation firm. Call Ron, he said. He's thorough. Ron was, in fact, thorough. I met with him, paid his retainer, handed over the printed emails and what little else I knew, the mileage patterns, the approximate frequency of the visits to the grandparents, the nothing I knew about the man himself. I told Ron I needed the full picture. Not just confirmation, but detail. Times, places, dates. The shape of this thing. He delivered. Ron's report was a document of methodical devastation. Photographs. Timestamps. A complete itinerary of an affair conducted with what I can only describe as logistical confidence. She would drop the kids at her parents' house, the 90-minute drive apparently a small price to pay for the freedom it purchased. Then she would double back to meet this man, I'll call him Bob, for lunch. And after lunch, they would go to a motel. Not a nice one. The kind that charges by the hour and asks no questions. She would spend a few hours there, then retrace her steps. Collect the children, drive home, begin dinner. The whole operation was timed. Practiced. It had a routine to it that suggested not impulsivity but planning, repeated, deliberate planning over what appeared to be a significant span of time. I read the report once, carefully. Then I put it down. Then I called a divorce lawyer. I should tell you something about where I come from, because it matters to what I did next. My parents cheated on each other. Not once, not in a moment of weakness that was subsequently repented and repaired, but repeatedly, operatically, in ways that eventually became known to everyone in the household including the children. The fallout was not clean. It was not adult or managed or contained. It was ugly in the way only sustained domestic warfare can be ugly, loud and grinding and ambient, present in every room of the house, soaking into the walls. My siblings and I grew up in it. We breathed it. It shaped things in us that took years to identify and longer to address. I had made myself a promise, somewhere in the wreckage of my childhood, that if I ever had children of my own I would handle the end of things differently. That if a marriage broke, it would break cleanly. That I would not put my kids through what my parents put us through. I would not weaponize them or use them as leverage or perform my grief and fury in front of them like some kind of ongoing theater they were forced to watch. So I moved deliberately. Quietly. Without tipping my hand. The divorce papers were drawn up. My lawyer was excellent, calm, unsentimental, focused. She walked me through the process with the precision of someone who had seen every variation of this particular human catastrophe and had developed, over the years, a kind of clinical competence that I found deeply reassuring. She confirmed what I had suspected: in my state, the infidelity wouldn't dramatically alter the legal proceedings. The law had evolved past punishment and into pragmatics. But I had one more thing I wanted to do before any papers were served. I went back to Ron. I asked him to find out everything he could about Bob. Not because I wanted to confront him. Not out of any fantasy of revenge or violence. I want to be clear about this, I am not a confrontational person, and whatever anger lived in me during those months had calcified into something colder and more purposeful than rage. I wanted information. I wanted the full picture. And I had a reason. Ron delivered again. Bob was, by all appearances, a man who had constructed a very comfortable life on a foundation that wasn't entirely his own. He was a VP of sales at his father-in-law's company. He and his wife lived in a house that, it turned out, was also owned by his in-laws. They had 3 children. His wife, I will call her Sandra, had, by all accounts, done everything right. Built a life, raised kids, supported her husband's career, trusted him with her family's name and her father's business. She had no idea. I thought about her for a long time. I thought about the mocking tone of those emails, my wife making fun of Sandra for her postpartum body, for the weight she'd gained after having kids. I thought about the fact that Sandra was sitting in a house her parents owned, raising her children, while her husband spent his afternoons in a motel that charged by the hour. And I made a decision. She deserved to know. Not as an act of vengeance toward Bob. Not to cause pain for its own sake. But because I believed, and still believe, that a person has the right to know the truth about their own life. Sandra was living inside a lie she hadn't chosen and hadn't consented to. What she did with the truth would be entirely up to her. But I was going to make sure she had it. I asked Ron for extra copies of his report. All of it, photos, dates, times, locations, the works. And on the same day my wife was served with divorce papers at her place of work, Ron drove to Sandra's home and knocked on her door. I have never spoken to Sandra. I don't know what she said when Ron explained why he was there. I don't know if she cried or went silent or slammed the door or simply stood there in the way that people sometimes stand when the walls of their world have just come down. I try not to imagine it too vividly, because imagining it means sitting with the fact that I was, in some way, the instrument of her devastation, even if the author of that devastation was her husband. What I do know is what happened next, because much of it became a matter of public record. Sandra moved fast. Within days, she had cleaned out their joint accounts. She took the children. She left. Her father, upon learning what Bob had done. What Bob had done while working for him, living in his house, representing his name, fired him. Immediately. No severance, no soft landing, no dignified exit. Just gone. And then the house situation clarified itself as well. The house where Bob had lived, raised his children, hosted dinner parties, the house that was, as it turned out, owned entirely by Sandra's parents, was no longer available to him. He was evicted. A VP of sales with no job, no savings, no house, no wife, and 3 children watching from a distance as their father discovered what it looked like when everything collapsed at once. The divorce proceedings were, to put it gently, not amicable. The court documents painted a picture of sustained acrimony. There were motions and countermotions, accusations flying in both directions, hearings that seemed to generate more hearings. At some point, and this is in the public record, Bob went to the house that used to be his. Sandra was there. An argument began. It escalated past words. Sandra's brother, apparently present and apparently unwilling to let it continue, intervened physically, and Bob walked away from that encounter with a broken nose and presumably a clearer understanding of the limits of the situation he had created. There were restraining orders. Police reports. Criminal charges. Jail time. Quiet intervals followed by new incidents, each one documented somewhere in the courthouse files of a county that had become intimately familiar with Bob's name. And then, eventually, silence. He left the state. I can't find him anywhere online, no LinkedIn profile, no social media footprint, no professional presence that I've been able to locate. He has, as far as the internet is concerned, ceased to exist in any findable form. Sandra, on the other hand, went to work at her father's company. She built something there. When her father retired, she took over. By any measure, she landed on her feet, not easily and not without cost, but with the kind of hard-won competence that sometimes emerges when people are forced to discover what they're actually made of. I find that genuinely satisfying. My own divorce was, by comparison, almost mundane. My ex-wife and I did not go to war. There was no contested scorched earth battle over assets or custody arrangements that required judicial intervention. We had 2 children together, and whatever had broken between us, that fact remained. I had made my peace with the idea that she would always be their mother, and that their mother's well-being mattered, not to me personally, not anymore, but to them, which meant it mattered in the only context that still applied. I kept my interactions with her strictly transactional. Questions about the kids. Logistics. Scheduling. I did not express anger. I did not relitigate. I did not bring up what I knew or use it as a weapon or perform the injury she had caused me in hopes that she would recognize its full dimensions. People sometimes find that cold. I found it clean. The children grew up. They became adults, complicated, funny, real people who I am genuinely proud of and love without reservation. They carry their own relationship with their mother, separate from mine, and that is as it should be. I no longer speak to my ex-wife. Not out of hatred or bitterness, I want to be precise about this, but simply because the thing that connected us, beyond our children, is gone, and I have no appetite for maintaining a relationship built on nothing but shared history and the proximity of damage. I don't hate her. I don't think about her much. She is the mother of my kids and therefore matters to them, which means she exists at the periphery of my life in that specific and limited way. Nothing beyond that. People sometimes ask me, when I tell this story, whether I have regrets. Whether I think I did the right thing. Whether involving Ron, serving papers and delivering evidence to Sandra on the same day, orchestrating the simultaneous detonation of 2 marriages, was justified. I've thought about it. I come back to the same place every time. I regret that any of it was necessary. I regret that my children grew up in a broken home, that their early years were shadowed by the aftermath of choices neither they nor I made. I regret that Sandra had to find out the way she did, though I cannot imagine a way she could have found out that would have felt kind. But I do not regret finding the truth. I do not regret acting on it. I do not regret telling Sandra, because I believe that she had a right to know, and I believe that living inside a lie, even a comfortable, prosperous, well-furnished lie, is a form of harm. And I do not regret the clean, quiet, purposeful way in which I moved through the end of my marriage rather than letting it become the kind of long, loud catastrophe my parents had made of theirs. My kids were not weaponized. They were not put in the middle. They were not forced to perform loyalty or choose sides or absorb the ambient radiation of 2 adults destroying each other in slow motion. They were protected from as much of it as I could manage, and then they were raised as well as I knew how to raise them. That, in the end, is the thing I am most certain about. Not the mileage logs or the printed emails or the PI's report or the simultaneous serving of papers across 2 households on one afternoon in the early 2000s. Those are just the mechanisms. The thing itself, the decision to handle ending with as much dignity as I could muster, that I'd make again without hesitation. The silence in a marriage where trust has died is a particular sound. Once you've heard it, you know it. The only question is what you do next. I knew what I wanted to do. I did it. And I have slept fine ever since.